Boom. The sound split the winter silence in two, not thunder, not gunfire, but the sharp crack of ice surrendering beneath a weight no one had seen coming. Samuel Hayes felt it through the ribs of his horse, a shudder that ran the length of the frozen prairie and climbed into his spine. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that didn't ask permission, didn't wait for daylight, didn't leave room for hesitation. He tightened his grip on the reins and urged his horse forward, the cold gnawing at the seams of his coat as though trying to carve its way inside. He had been traveling for hours, heading back from a distant homestead where he'd delivered supplies before the storm closed in. The world around him felt hollowed out, like the sky had forgotten color and the earth had forgotten kindness. Samuel was used to lonely landscapes, he carried one inside himself. But this silence was different. It trembled. It warned. And then he saw it, a dark shape slumped beside the frozen creek, half swallowed by drifting snow. For a heartbeat he wondered if his mind, tired from the cold, was playing tricks. But when he dismounted and stepped closer, he felt the truth hit him harder than the wind. A woman lay curled against the ice, her braid rimed with frost, her breath thin as thread. She couldn't have been more than 28, though the cold had carved shadows along her cheekbones. Samuel knelt beside her, the weight of the moment settling on him like a familiar burden. He had seen people lost to winter before, and he knew the stillness that came after the cold one. This wasn't that stillness. This was struggle. Fragile. Fading. Her fingers twitched as though fighting a dream she couldn't wake from. "You're not dying today," he murmured, though his voice blended into the storm and reached no one but himself. He gathered her in his arms, startled by how light she was, how stiff her cloak had become. Her skin felt like riverstone left too long in shadow. He wrapped his coat around her and lifted her onto his horse, whispering a steady stream of reassurance meant more for his own steadiness than hers. An abandoned barn stood a short ride away, a place he'd passed many times without ever stopping. Tonight it looked like salvation, hunched and weary but standing its ground against the storm. He carried her inside, set her near the remnants of an old fire pit, and struck a match. The flame caught slowly, flickering like a frail hope that refused to die. Samuel fed it dry splinters until warmth began to pulse through the air. The woman's breathing steadied but didn't strengthen. Her eyelids fluttered, not quite waking, not letting go. Samuel watched her with a quiet heaviness, recognizing something he couldn't yet name. She wasn't just a stranger on a frozen trail. She was a turning point disguised as tragedy. He kept the lantern burning through the long night, sitting close enough to guard her but far enough to honor whatever stories shaped her life. Her presence stirred a tension he hadn't expected, an old ache reminding him of the brother he'd once failed to save, of the promise he'd whispered over a grave colder than any winter. Not again. Not this time. Near dawn, the storm softened its howl. Samuel stepped outside to gather more wood, but a sound snapped him upright, a splintering crack, sudden and fierce, echoing through the brittle air. He rushed back into the barn as her eyes flew open, wide with confusion and fear. She sat up too fast, breath jagged, gaze searching for whatever had broken her world before the cold found her. Her hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength, and in that grasp Samuel felt the jolt of something unmistakable, a past full of danger still chasing her, something colder than the winter he'd pulled her from. And suddenly he understood. The storm wasn't the only thing she had been running from. And as the barn trembled under another distant crack, Samuel realized this was only the beginning of a danger neither of them yet understood. Boom! The second crack of ice thundered through the morning like fate slamming its fist against the door, and Ayanna flinched before she could stop herself. The sound dragged her mind back to the night she'd been separated from her traveling group, back to the moment danger found her on the ridge. Samuel felt her whole body jolt, and though she tried to hide it, fear trembled through her like a trapped ember searching for air. She steadied herself with a slow breath, her eyes adjusting to the dim barn light, the scent of smoke clinging to the air. Samuel watched her gently, the distance between them shrinking without either of them meaning it to. She didn't know this man, not truly, yet something about his quietness felt familiar, as though he understood storms not because he survived them, but because he carried one inside him too. He offered her water, stepping close enough for warmth but not close enough to crowd the fragile space her spirit was gathering back. She accepted it with shaking hands, grateful not just for the drink but for the way he looked at her. Measured, respectful, unhurried. No curiosity sharpened his gaze, only concern shaped by experience. She had known men who demanded explanations the moment kindness was offered. Samuel asked for nothing. His silence invited trust without pressing for it. Ayanna studied his face, noting the tired lines carved by years that had asked more of him than he'd been ready to give. There was a gentleness in him, buried beneath the roughness of frontier life, a softness he kept tucked behind his eyes as if worried someone might mistake it for weakness. She understood that hiding. Life had taught her that vulnerability was not always safe to show, especially to strangers, yet here she was, warmed by it. Samuel broke the quiet first, his voice low, the kind that made words feel softer than they were. He told her his name, then waited. She whispered hers back, and something in him shifted, like a knot loosened. Ayanna. The name lingered in the air between them, heavier than a simple introduction. It carried history, sorrow, and an unspoken resilience, all woven into its graceful sound. When she tried to stand, her legs trembled beneath her, and Samuel steadied her with the lightest touch, as if afraid his strength might bruise her. Pride urged her to pull away, but exhaustion softened her resistance. She allowed his support, feeling the steadiness in his hand, the certainty in his posture. It had been a long time since someone offered help without expecting something in return. That absence of expectation rattled her more than the cold had. As the storm eased outside, the barn filled with a calmer hush, the kind that deepened breathing and softened thoughts. Ayanna told him fragments of what had happened, how her group had traveled ahead, how she fell behind when the storm rose too fast, how footsteps she didn't recognize had followed her until the night swallowed everything. She didn't tell him the full fear, not yet. But Samuel heard the parts she didn't speak, his silence absorbing every tremor in her voice. He responded by sharing a piece of his own past, unwrapped carefully, like revealing a wound he'd learned to live beside. He spoke of his younger brother lost to a winter accident years ago, the grief that hollowed him, and the guilt that refused to leave. Ayanna listened without flinching. She didn't offer sympathy, only presence, and he found it strangely healing to be heard without being pitied. Hours passed with quiet conversations and long stretches of thoughtful silence. They weren't bonded by romance or fate's loud declarations, only by the soft recognition of two wounded souls finding warmth where they least expected it. Samuel noticed the steadiness returning to her breathing, the calm settling in her shoulders. Ayanna noticed the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, as if he'd forgotten how to talk gently until now. But when the wind outside suddenly shifted, carrying the faint echo of distant movement, footsteps or something heavier, Ayanna's expression tightened. Samuel noticed instantly. The fear that flashed across her face wasn't the fear of weather or memory. It was present, near, real. And when she whispered that someone might have followed her through the storm, the barn's thin walls seemed to pull closer, listening with them. Samuel's jaw tightened. She was not just a woman he had saved from winter. She was someone being hunted.